policy. Taxes are about policy, results, and priorities, and I do believe that this is an area that is a priority. Now let's go to the larger issue. Let's go back to the deficit and the debt, because clearly those are created by imbalances between revenues and expenses. And as Colleen rightly said, by the end of the 1990s, we did have a balanced budget. We had right-sized revenues and expenses, and then we fell off the wagon because we did not maintain fiscal discipline. We did not make the tough decisions. Government is easy when you're in a good economic time. You earn your job. You earn the right to be there making the decisions when you face the reality and the tough times that we've been in the past couple of years. Let's go back to pay-go, because pay-go is an important tool. It means that you have to face the facts. If you want to reduce a tax, then what is the fiscal consequence? You expect that tax to pay for itself. You want to increase spending, and I agree with Charles, that we have not faced up to the reality of increased spending. It has not been kept up with revenues. Where we do disagree is on whether and to what extent we government, us, should have collectively provided an out of a very difficult economic time. He says the government didn't have a role. I say the government did have a role. There was a consequence to that. But now how do we dig out of that? Now how do we dig out of that? pay-go imposes discipline. And as we go down the road, it will be a lot tougher for any party, any president, to wiggle out of those tough decisions. And that's why we will have tough times coming up in the next decade to dig ourselves out.
Our rotation continues on this one. Again, it's begins with Charles and over to Colleen and back to Ed. This pertains to housing and mortgage finance. Currently, there is increasing discussion of the need for banking and financial services regulatory reform. Included in the mix of discussions are reforms of the secondary mortgage market, which include Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two of the nation's government-sponsored enterprises, or GSEs. The different models for reform of the secondary mortgage market range from total privatization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to total public ownership of the GSEs. The current problems with liquidity in the housing mortgage markets have illustrated the importance of some degree of public involvement when private lending activity is constrained. Do you support some level of government participation in the secondary mortgage market to ensure liquidity, and why or why not?
Yes, I do. I do believe that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as created by the federal government initially, were good concepts. Now that we've had a clear meltdown in the financial industry, getting them back on their feet is important, and that's something that I think is critical for the U.S. Congress to do. With that said, though, I think one of the big problems with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac a few years ago was this concept of moral hazard. Let me explain that just a little bit briefly. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were supposed to be owned and operated as independent companies with no risk to the American taxpayer. That is, if they collapsed, it was all on the shareholders of those particular companies. But Congress never completely cut the cord, allowing them to extend risks, I think, to reasonable levels. And they continue to do that because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were some of the biggest political contributors to members of Congress. Because I believe in the free market, because I do believe that it's important to get liquidity in the mortgage market, while I do believe organizations like Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac are important, once we get them back on the feet, the United States Congress must make it very clear. If they are lending money and helping with loans, do not ask the taxpayer to back you up. The taxpayer cannot, should not be the lender of last resort to these agencies. Yes, the taxpayer and the public has a role in establishing these agencies, but the risks must be borne by these two particular entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And I think a wrong way to go is to have the federal government dictate it all. I know there are a number of proposals going around Congress that say, well, let's eliminate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac completely and just let the federal government solely dictate how the mortgage industry develops, who should and should not get loans. I'll tell you, that is the wrong approach, not something I support.
I think when we look at the whole issue regarding mortgage and what has happened, we can't ignore the context in which it happened. It all starts because Washington decided that there were entities that were too big to fail. And as a result of the too big to fail, it then trickled down to all the different kinds of banking industries and so forth. Because when you're salvaging the big guys, what happens is the small guys are going to be left to suffer. Let's look at the problem. The problem that we all face and the criticism that's been out there is because of subprime mortgages. And the question is, why did this happen? Why was it allowed to happen? And how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? I think that it would be wrong to simply do away with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. However, I think that before we get to that question, we got to look at what caused all of these problems. What's causing the problems, for example, when Washington starts to look at thrifts who are there to, and they make pretty sound mortgage loans. Why are we looking at them? Why are we looking at regulating all these various other entities? We must stop and do a clear analysis as to what the cause has been and whether we have permitted different kinds of entities that are non-regulated to step into this mortgage market, not only giving rise to the subprime crisis, but other crises relating to the mortgage industry. Again, we are talking about, when we talk about home ownership, one of the major assets of the people. Average people, people like you and me, that's our major investment in our lives in the home. We cannot permit the mortgage industry to suffer, and we cannot let them suffer at the cost of all these big entities.
Well, I certainly find myself agreeing with my colleagues on my left and right, both physically and politically. I guess there's a reason why I'm sitting in the middle of here. To the specific question, do I believe that there should be some level of government participation? Yes, I believe that there should be some level of government participation. This goes back to a broader question that I touched on in my introductory remarks, where I think there are distinct differences between me and my fellow candidates, and that is the role of government. Should this be left purely to the private market? I don't think so. I don't think that the private market has done the job or can do the job or should do all the job. Should it be a government completely government absorbed and run? No, absolutely not. The government cannot do this job better than the private sector, nor some combination of private sector and quasi-public entity. And so what are we really trying to do here? We're trying to create some level of safety within the markets so that the liquidity can continue, so that the capital can continue to flow. Now, when this thing melted down on all of us, it was a failure across the board. Yes, it did start with subprimes as a continuing, as a contributing factor, but it did contribute all the way through the market to the largest entities, and it was also a failure of proper, reasonable regulation. There's a lot of lessons to be learned in all of this, but I don't think that that necessarily means that we need to take the entire structure and turn it on its head and go one way, way on the other side, or into an all government-run operation.
In the interest of time now, so that we stay on our schedule, we are now going to go to questions that have been submitted specifically from the audience today, in which we will take 3 questions. The first being, what specifically could you do to promote the development of small business? And our first rotation, it'll be Colleen to Ed Charles.
We all know that small business is the backbone of our nation, and definitely it's about 96% of the businesses in the state are small businesses. The one thing I constantly hear from small business, especially from my good buddy Sam Snow, is that government interferes much too much in small business. I believe that the way we can encourage small business, though, however, is to make, for example, the healthcare reform bill that we have looked at, it is to actually subsidize small business in the cost of covering employee health care. That would be one measure that's going to be very critical, so that no one pays more for 80%, which is what our